and welcome to episode 55 of the Drunken Boxing Podcast, coming to you, as always, from Beijing. Alright, before I get into some Mushin martial culture news, for those of you that don't know, I have recently launched another YouTube channel called the Drunken Boxing Podcast Clips channel. Now, the aim of this is to upload shorts that highlight interesting topics, discussions, and pieces from some of the podcasts that I've done over the years in an effort to try spread awareness and get people interested in the podcast to start listening to it for the benefit of those that are interviewed, as well as for the Chinese martial arts as a whole. If you haven't yet, I request humbly that you subscribe to the channel and watch the clips and share them with your friends, etc., so we can get some traction and greater awareness for the Chinese martial arts. Now, the Chinese martial arts are quite niche in any case, particularly in the West in the grand scheme of things. And the arts that I feature, usually with the practitioners that I interview, Xingyi Quan, Bagua, Zhang, and the like, are even more niche. So it's not easy to get the general populace interested in the subject, as most of them are unaware of it. So that is the purpose of the Clips channel. I hope that it gets people's or piques their interest in the topics that are raised in the discussions and get them to be interested to listen to the full interviews, and from there reach out to teachers, reach out to the people that have been interviewed, and get into the practice of Chinese martial arts. And I need your help to do that. So I'm trying to get a number of subscribers to it to make the channel actually go into that algorithm state that YouTube shares it more, and I need your help to do it. So head on over to the Drunken Boxing Podcast Clips channel and subscribe to it if you haven't already. All right, let's get into some Mushin martial culture news. I have released a full series as well as a couple of other things, but the primary focus that I released since the last podcast was a 3-part series that features a mini documentary with Chen Zhenglei. Now, much like the Liu Jingru series that I released a year and a bit ago, it's a locally produced documentary that was long, and I split it into 3 parts that I have subtitled, I have translated, I have dubbed, I have edited, added additional information, etc., because I just found that the topics discussed and the people interviewed were highly interesting. So check it out. I have released all 3 episodes already. I worked very hard to get it done as quickly as possible. They are immense tasks translating such things. They take a very long time to translate and word correctly, and then to edit, etc. takes a while too, to add background information. So I'm quite chuffed with myself that I got all 3 episodes done in this short period. The 3 episodes in total end up running for about 30 minutes in total. So I've split it up into 3 parts to make it easier for you guys to watch them at your leisure, and they are out now. Additionally, I released a short glimpse into one of Xingyi Quan's 12 animals, specifically the Sparrow-Hawk. As I've done with some of the previous animals, I've released myself performing the animal itself, and the performance, as with the previous ones, is drawn from a in-depth lesson on this animal that is on the Patreon online learning program, the Huajin online learning program. So you can take a look at this animal, its practice from the Hebei Xingyi Quan lineage, and if you're interested, head on over to the Huajin online learning program. It's grown tremendously in the 3 years that it's been running. There are hundreds of very in-depth, detailed lessons where you can get into the arts of Xingyi Quan and Bagua Zhang in depth from wherever you are. Alright, that's all from Mushin martial culture. Let's get into today's podcast. My guest today is Jess O'Brien. Now, I first came to know about Jess O'Brien through a book he released quite some time ago called Nei Jia Quan, Internal Martial Arts, Teachers of Taiji Quan, Xingyi Quan, and Bagua Zhang. I managed to get the 2nd edition of this book in the late 2000s, and the 1st edition came out sometime before that. It is no longer in print, so if you're looking to get this book, which I highly recommend, probably have to try source a second-hand copy. It's highly recommended. It features interviews that Jess did with teachers of these arts in the West, some of them visiting, some of them living and teaching in the USA, the greater USA, and they're fascinating. Firstly, because they give you insights into differing teachers' perspectives, which are always great, but more so for the time that he released this, which was, as mentioned, mid to late 2000s. This is a time that people might have been aware of Taiji, but Xingyi and Bagua in the West, not so well known. So having this released at that time is already a pioneering effort from Jess. I wanted to discuss with him his process to have this and to compile this book, as well as his own journey in the arts that he practices. He is a practitioner of Xingyi Quan and Bagua Zhang. He studied under B.K. Franzis for many years, as well as under Luo Dexiu of the Taiwan Yizong lineage. And he himself still teaches today. With that, I bring you Jess O'Brien.
Welcome to the Drunken Boxing Podcast. Very happy that we're finally getting to do this. Jess O'Brien, how are you doing today?
Good. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. It's my pleasure. First of all, Happy New Year to you. It's officially the first day of the Chinese New Year today, the Year of the Dragon. So it makes this podcast double special. You're the first podcast in this Year of the Dragon.
Exciting. Thanks for the welcome and Happy New Year to you.
Thank you. Thank you. So maybe you want to give you a bit of an introduction, your background for the listeners?
Sure. I guess I've been around, the martial arts scene since the 90s, I suppose, and got interested in Chinese martial arts back then. So, Byron, you and I are from a generation that we often mention before YouTube and before internet and before the easy exchange of information about Chinese martial arts. So
yeah,
at the time, it was books and magazines that you could get your hands on and maybe videotapes occasionally that would be passed around. So it was an information environment where you had to go out and get it,
Yep.
Like Chinese martial arts was hard to find back then, basically.
Yeah, very true, very true. But you know what? To be honest, I wouldn't change a thing about all of that. To be honest, I mean, those discoveries, finding a magazine, it was even more difficult for people, like at least in the States, which is where you guys had most of the publishing done. For us outside to get like a local, a newsstand or a magazine store, etc., to import a Inside Kungfu or a Kungfu Wushu magazine was like you had to go search for them. I remember driving half an hour out at like where I was living to find one store that would occasionally have them,
Right.
and it was like a treasure hunt. It was great.
And like you said, when you found something, it was super exciting. And I had a similar experience when I moved down to the Bay Area to try and access more training here in California. And you'd go to Chinese bookstores or Japanese bookstores to look for martial arts books. And in the Chinese martial arts, I memorized the characters for Bagua Zhang and Xingyi Quan. So I would thumb through the martial arts section trying to figure out and if you found a book of your style, it was just like a score,
Totally.
It's something you'd never even heard of because it was, you'd never heard. It was just most of what was out there. You had, there was no central place to figure out what was what. And so I think for me, my defining experience when I was young, just getting into this stuff, was reading the Bagua Zhang journal.
Yes.
And for those of us who were around at that time, I think it made a big impact because it was the first time you had quality, consistent information coming from mainland China, as well as from Taiwan and Hong Kong. And
it was deep.
I mean, it was great. It was deep.
Yeah, that was something that you wouldn't usually get from the general magazines. They couldn't. I mean, the format didn't allow you for this depth.
The magazines were flashy, and you'd be lucky to find an article in there about an internal martial arts style, and they were usually kind of not that authentic or just sort of phony. And Bagua Zhang Journal had that sense of authority to it, and that research behind it, and the translations of source texts, which again at the time were super hard to find.
Yeah.
And so it's just you and I are part. That when I was looking at your new book, thinking, look how far we've come from when we were scrambling to get little scraps. And, Vince Black did his translation of Li Ziming's book, and everybody who was in the Bagua world, that was a moment when we were like, oh my God, here it is. These are the words, because up until that point, those foreigners, we didn't have the slogans and the poems and the statements. We had no idea about that stuff. So, and your book goes so much further into depth and gives us history and context that, I can capture that whole era from there till now and how amazingly far it's come. But at the same time, I do miss when when you found something, it meant something, or when you got a new form or a technique, you'd copy it and write it down and think about it. And now there's just so much that it doesn't have that specialness quite like it once did.
Well, we were searching for crouching tigers and hidden dragons back then. And when you found a glimpse or you saw a scale shining through of the dragon somewhere, you'd get so excited. But I think it affected me in general. That I mean, I have such a. For me, there's a couple of things that are my cherished possessions. One of them, of course, are my martial art weapons. So it doesn't matter where I go, if I'm gonna whichever country I've lived in. That's one thing that's gone with me everywhere. The other thing is my book collection. So for me, I'm very old school. I don't really read. I don't like ebooks. I like printed books. I like the smell and the feel of the paper. So I have bookshelf after bookshelf, covered in filled with books, and that's the other thing that goes with
here.
me. And your book is actually one that influenced me and affected me many years ago as well. So for me, your book is one of I think it's required reading for people that practice, the internal Chinese martial arts, Xingyi拳鷂形 Zhang, Tai Chi. But even outside of that, I mean, there's, again, your book, I had heard about it, but I never was able to get it. I was living in South Africa.
Oh, okay, yeah. So maybe hard to come by in the early 00s.
Right.
It first came out in 2002,
So exactly. And then I was on a trip to Canada, actually, in Toronto. The South African national team they had some Sanda athletes that were fighting in Toronto, and I was the team manager, and I went
awesome.
I had already, basically made up my mind that day one, check the team in. After that, go look for bookstores. And it was really by chance. There was a bookstore across the street. And then when I asked them, do you have any martial arts books? And they pointed me to the martial arts section, which was a tiny little shelf. There wasn't much. And your book was there. I was like, oh, great. Finally, I can get a copy. And that, like I said, I think that was 2009. Yeah, I think it was 2009.
Okay.
And it was the second edition, so it wasn't even the first edition.
Right.
So the second edition is black, if I remember, and the first edition was a different color.
Right.
And, that book, I remember, I read most of it on that trip. I had already finished it. I just dived right into it. Those interviews, it's also a glimpse into that time. In the USA, when these arts, which are generally, they weren't so mainstream, and these few teachers that were teaching them openly, and so it's a great book. I've gone back to it many times.
It did capture the time. It's a snapshot of that moment, and those teachers, it's a snapshot of where they were at that moment, and all of them continued to grow and change too. But I did want to because I had the opportunity, I just said, okay, I'll take a snapshot of this time period. And just leave behind. And I didn't quite completely maybe even understand everything I was being told. I figured I'd just write it all down, type it all up, and then later I'll dig through it and try to figure out what everyone was trying to teach.
Right.
And so it created this sort of record of that time and that moment. And then, in the years since, I'll flip back and be, wow, I didn't remember I was told that. And it's not, and each of them wasn't necessarily even telling me. I felt like they knew it was for a book, so they wanted to give me a chunk of their philosophy and their approach more than they weren't talking to me directly. They really were talking to the readers, and I think that was one of the things that made it great because they all the guys I approached and agreed to, nearly everyone agreed to do it and really gave part of their, they opened their heart to me and spoke to me openly, even people I couldn't even speak their language. And they seemed to, I don't know, they sensed my sincerity or something. But they also could tell that this was going to eventually get released, so they wanted to leave a mark, and they wanted to leave a few of their own words that people could compare. And so I was kind of touched by that because when I first approached people, like Zhao Da Yuan, your Kung Fu uncle,
right.
I went to his class, and at the end of class, I walked up and said, "Hey, do you have time for a 2-hour interview?" And he said, "Sure, why not? Let's do it."
But Zhao Da Yuan has got such a great personality, so.
Right.
I mean, people don't know this if they haven't interacted with him, but you think he's this very, you'd expect him to be this very serious and stout, and I mean he's
looks like he could be.
Yeah, I mean he's an ex-public security officer. He was teaching the police, apprehension methods. He still is a consultant for them today. And then you meet the guy, and he's just all smiles, and he even cracks jokes most of the time. So he's a very nice guy. That was my, when I first met him, when I was training with my teacher, I was kind of nervous. I didn't know what to expect, and then he was cracking jokes and being so, he's just got such a sunny personality. So
absolutely.
Are you interested in learning authentic traditional Chinese martial arts of Xingyi Quan and Bagua? Well, if that's the case, the Huajin Online Learning Program is for you. The Huajin Online Learning Program is the premier distance learning program where you can learn authentic arts of Hebei Xingyi Quan and Liang style Bagua in a comprehensive and in-depth manner from wherever you are. Featuring over 120 in-depth lessons covering aspects of individual training, technique refinement, forms, application, partner work, conditioning, internal skill building and qigong, and much more. The Huajin Online Learning Program has been running successfully for over 3 years and is highly praised by participants within the program. So start your journey into learning authentic classical Chinese martial arts today by visiting mushinmartialculture.com to find out more or to sign up directly at patreon.com/mushinmartialculture. That is the Huajin Online Learning Program. Enroll today.
And that is the commonality. Maybe it's just because of the people I sought out, but people did have a sense of humor and a sense of perspective. And it wasn't, nobody, even some of the people who had been through real, like Zhao Yuan, for instance, who had been in real, used in either in war or in combat or in fighting, they still had, they weren't intimidating in that sense. They still had a sense of humor and a sense of enjoyment and a sense of love for the arts so even a little old lady could come train in their class, or some tough young guys could come train in their class. They had something for everyone, and that's what makes a complete martial art. And that, again, was one of the things Zhao Yuan said was, you need to study Chinese martial arts on every level, from the philosophy, from the literature behind it, from the physical movements, from the healing, from the fighting. You need to touch all those areas. And you may not complete them all, but to see the real depth, all of those things must be present for a real martial arts style from China.
Completely agree. So that's one of the kind of issues I think we might be seeing more in today's environment, where people are so focused on, well, is it effective in the ring? And we've got MMA, and of course, it's not focused on a single perspective. That's exactly the issue.
And that's the beauty of it. I
exactly.
think, and that's also the challenge of it for foreigners, is like, we want to put it in a box and understand it and reduce it down to its most essentials. I think that's maybe a feature of especially American culture, where you try to take something big and squeeze out what's useful out of it and just take it, sort of Bruce Lee effect. But I think in the long run, Chinese martial arts will find its most use and relevance by preserving that full picture. And maybe as our fight world develops, say a few centuries, then maybe we'll need to call upon that depth and that way of life that's there above and beyond the fighting, which obviously, if you do martial arts, you've got to love that part too, because that's
for sure.
the funnest part.
Yeah. It's got to be a solid foundation, but don't ignore the other aspects. They're life enriching, and that's why these arts are lifestyle practices. They're not career in terms of, I'm going to enter a combat sport practice, although you can take parts out of it for that. So there is value to that too. There is value to the idea of the format of MMA and all of that.
Absolutely.
Because it gives you the opportunity to draw parts out that you want to focus on. But, people need to understand you're missing out the full picture if you only focus on one part. And as you get older and as you realize these aspects of training and their true value, aspects like the community in your martial family, the mentorship that you get from the relationship with your teacher, which in Chinese we call shifu, which literally has the character for father in it, and there is that relationship. These are aspects that are outside of the realm of what is the practical use of the art, the mental well-being that you get out of having a discipline, but also a community of brethren or sisters, etc.
That community keeps you on track and has a connection to you. And as you're talking about that, I'm thinking of all the world's biggest problems right now of mental health issues, loneliness epidemic, people not having a reason to live in life. And I think Chinese martial arts throughout history has had that way of life attached to it to give people, sometimes some of the more quirkier people in society find their way to Chinese martial arts because it's a home for whoever really dedicates themselves to it. And again, some of the people I interviewed, maybe a guy in his 80s, he and I could share something that we both had this childish love for this martial art thing, even though our lives were completely different. He was from a completely different world from me, and yet on this thing we could relate and we could share a connection that we never could have otherwise, right? Like there's
Yeah.
these people out there who love it like you do, and you could be worlds apart. But there's something really enriching about that and gives you a reason to keep going, because if all you want to do is just sort of win at whatever you're doing in this moment, you eventually find some hollowness there. So the relationships you're talking about, the connection to history, the connection to the philosophy,
Culture.
I don't know. I mean, some people think that's getting in the way, but for me, I don't know. That helps me stay interested and enjoy and keep out. And every day I go and train again, and I need some inspiration, and I need those other aspects help keep me exercising and keep me busy and having fun. You know?
Well, it also helps you to understand, like learning the perspectives that the martial arts from whichever culture they come from, the perspectives of that culture helps you to understand people better. So if you can understand the mentality of Chinese people better through the study of martial arts, and by that you've learned culture, history, philosophy, etc., that'll help you in your day-to-day life when you're dealing with different people, for example.
Yeah.
So you might have been from a Western perspective and thought some particular trait or behavior of a Chinese person be odd or unacceptable or whatever, but it's simply because you haven't understood where it's coming from. And just by learning this, you're gonna it's a society building exercise to understand other cultures better. And especially at the level that we do it in martial arts, it's you're going to go quite deep into it. I mean, honestly speaking, there's a level of philosophy and culture within classical arts like Xingyi and Bagua that even the Chinese themselves don't know until they start going deeper into it. And then they understand more about themselves. I've seen that many times. So
just because you're of Chinese descent doesn't mean you automatically somehow know this. Like, it's a skill they have to develop. Like, they know the cultural background and the language better, but again, the skill and the training, hey, everybody's got to earn that one day at a time.
Well, yeah, exactly. Skill and knowledge is not hereditary.
Right.
Everybody has to earn it and put in the time. It doesn't matter whether you're born into Chinese culture or not. It's not going to magically appear in your mind and your understanding until you dive deeper into it. So
well, and when that brings up another thing that I was thinking about is, I admire you for your love of Chinese martial arts, taking you to China, learning the language, participating in the culture directly. A lot for those of my friends and classmates who've done that, they make a lot of sacrifices and they work really hard to go overseas, to train, to leave behind their normal, easy world to live in a different place and really get deep into this. And I as a young man, at some point I had the opportunities maybe I could have gone for, but I took a different path and, became a very average citizen here. But I do admire you, Byron, for taking on that task and like bringing back information that other people outside China can help understand better. And so I just want to say, the rest of us who weren't able to do that, we respect you guys for doing that and making the sacrifices to be there and encounter Chinese culture directly. And in the long run, hopefully, again, helping us understand Chinese martial arts way better. So just wanted to shout that out.
But don't sell yourself short, because your book is one of the things that sparked a interest to go deeper. So
Cool.
and I don't think I'm alone in that. I think, like you mentioned, the Bagua Zhang journal, etc. All of those art. There's a lot of people that that made these sacrifices to travel, whether it was short periods annually or to move for a period of time. And so we're just continuing on with that. Not everybody can do it, so I want to share whatever I can share.
Absolutely appreciate it. And those of us back here totally appreciate it. And in the vein of a guy like Robert W. Smith, who wrote the original Chinese boxing book, and he really did his best to like get deep into it. And so my book was an attempt to follow that book and other books like that. Also Bagua Journal, where we're translating. I felt like I want to go in that same tradition and just keep bringing up multiple perspectives. And I think, what I often say about the book and whenever I talk about it is like, by the time I was done, every point of view had been both promoted and denigrated by each other. In other words, every teacher was opposite of at least one of the other teachers in the books.
Right.
And for the audience, it feels like that's an important thing to keep in mind when you're studying Chinese fine arts in general, probably, but especially martial arts, where you may have a very authentic perspective that is different from somebody else's, but they're all under this same umbrella. So you can't say my martial art is the one that is most focused on doing everything right, because you've got to understand, like, these other perspectives can also be right in their own way. So if someone says, I don't teach any sparring, or someone else says sparring is the first thing I begin with, or we don't involve chi in our teaching whatsoever, and someone else said chi is the primary thing, and then there's everyone in between. So you end up with a very confusing mass, which some people, find really annoying. I'm sure people in Asia, as well as people here, find that confusing. Like, couldn't we just get a straight answer out of these guys? But that's the trouble with art. It's never going to be defined in the way sport can, where you really have a final goal and a winner and a loser.
Right.
Fine arts are never going to be that way. And I'm glad my book captured that, because by the time I felt one guy was persuading me, I'm like, he's totally right. And then the next guy would persuade me that he was right. So, and you just come in full circle and realize you pick the directions that suit you best.
Well, exactly. You can just listen to the information and then put the time in, and your conclusion will be correct because it's your conclusion, So you'll find the value in your own practice. So that's the other thing about talking about martial arts alone, or talking, listening, understanding, and then putting the time into practice, because you need that experience, and then yourself understanding something and getting to a certain point. Maybe your experience through training will be slightly different, even to your own Kung Fu brother under the same teacher.
Right.
So you get to a different point at the end, and that's okay. You understand why you're at that point. Even if I compare my teacher to his Kung Fu brothers, they've all got slightly different quirks and abilities and focuses, but they all came from the same teacher. So. Yeah. So
there you go. And that's one of the great things about being as a student, is able to pursue your teachers, classmates, or your Kung Fu uncles and aunts who learned in previous generations. That's how you can go on that treasure hunt again and find the people who were there at a different era from you, and what was taught then and how that compares to now. And I've been lucky enough to, a couple of the schools I've trained in over the years, been able to meet relatives from other directions. And that gives you a really invaluable triangulation of what your teacher taught you, is to see what his teacher taught his Kung Fu brothers, and just make those analyses and pick up little bits and pieces that will work for you and still be part of that same art form. And I don't know, those mentors are critical, right? Because learning from your own teacher is one thing, but you need older brothers, to beat you up and use the techniques on you, because your teacher's he's only going to be able to beat you up so much. You need, you need time outside of class to challenge and test and fight and try it out. And you need people who are better than you to show you how to do it right. And then you go to other schools and other branches of the same art and see what they do. So I'm a big fan of visiting other schools. I've always felt welcomed, and always felt it's nerve-wracking at first when you go and you feel like, oh my God, what if they don't like me or whatever? But I've always found, so much friendship, and somebody always knows somebody who knows somebody. And I've traveled all over America, not the world, unfortunately, but here in the States, I seem to always have a friend in whatever city I go to who's the friend of a friend, or a school brother or whatever. So if you keep that, I've found that part of my journey is I do my own training, but I've also found it really useful to go check in with, hey, my teacher had a classmate who lived X, Y, or Z. Maybe he had some students. Why don't I see if I can find them and send them an email,
My whole life is a lie.
Are floppy Chinese swords getting you down? Do you practice traditional Chinese martial arts but have difficulty locating and sourcing firm, solid steel training swords? Well, look no further. Available now on the Mushin Martial Culture online store are high-quality, custom-made, hard steel traditional training swords. Made from the highest quality materials, these swords have both the feel and weight distribution of traditional, authentic Chinese martial arts swords, featuring high-quality scabbards, as well as the option to include a historically accurate handle wrap. This sword is built to last. Head on over to the Mushin Martial Culture online store to order yours today. Available as well on the store are other items, apparel, training shoes, and other unique Chinese martial arts merchandise. The URL is mushinmartialculture.com. Ditch the tin foil and get yourself a sword you can be proud of.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, it's a very important part. I remember in the early days with my teacher. I remember one weekend, and somebody arrived, and he seemed fairly advanced, and I was like, who is this guy? Is he a new student? He's like, no, he's Zhao Dayuan's student. I said, so why is he training here? He said, when they want to learn Xingyi, Zhao Dayuan sends them to me. When my students want to refine their Qina, they go to Zhao Dayuan, and that happened like numerous times. We had like cross pollination between the two, the two of them. So, that's
awesome.
Yeah, and like you also get to see their slightly different perspectives from Zhao Dayuan when they come to us, and vice versa. So it's great.
And family relationships aren't always great. That happens.
Oh, true. True.
But a lot of times, though, like an uncle might see you in a more favorable light. And you might have, maybe they have some hard feelings with your teacher or whatever, but maybe you can he'll recognize your love of the art too or whatever. So there's, I don't know, it can't get complicated. But you're lucky to have that connect. You're training in Beijing, at the center of your martial arts, so you have that family there to rely on and who can bring new, fresh perspective to the art. And that's how it should be. That's how I hope we can keep it.
Well, I wanted to ask you a couple of questions. I still want to get into your background of your own personal training, but I want to stay on the topic of the book. Which year did you say the first edition was published? When you first released it?
2002 it first came out.
So that's fairly early in the general picture of these Xingyi, Bagua, Taiji more, not so much, but Xingyi and Bagua for sure. And I want to ask you, like, how did you get, because it was published, so how did you get the publisher to agree to this kind of at that time, and even the title, I'm pretty sure the publisher couldn't even pronounce it, like Nei Jia Quan, what is this?
Yeah, the sales meetings were weird. It was, my martial arts journey has always kind of connected with books because I'm kind of a book nerd, which you might relate to, it sounds like too.
Yeah.
But, all through high school and college, I was doing Aikido all the time. And I had been reading the Aikido books that were out at the time. And I'd run across, then I got into Chinese martial arts, and my teacher gave me a copy of Chinese boxing because his teacher had been from Taiwan. So I was like, oh my God, these stories are awesome. Like, I love the action. And I knew that this was going to be for me. And so I found my way into it. But eventually I ended up getting a job with an internship with a publisher who had done a lot of these Aikido books and Chinese martial arts books. Okay. The publisher of Chinese boxing, as well as Aikido and the New Warrior was one, and a bunch of others that were groundbreaking at the time. So that's what it was. I just applied for the internship, moved to Berkeley, started working for this guy, and then ended up having a long career in publishing. I think I started down there in 98, so I'm still doing it today. So it was an incredibly, martial arts pretty much gave me the in to my whole career and my whole life and my whole family that I've raised. And so, martial arts books have been a big part of that. So I was an editor for the company at a certain, I started off as an intern, but eventually got a job. And so I was able to work on a lot of the martial arts books that came through North Atlantic Books and the imprint Blue Snake books that they created. So I got to work on Louis Swaim's translation of Fu Zhongwen's book and his and Yang Chengfu's book, T.T. Liang's Steal My Art book. That's a great one. Right. Power of Internal Martial Arts by B.K. Franzis, Barbara Davis Taiji Chuan Classics. These all came out in the early 2000s, sort of before the internet took off, when information was a little harder to find. So we published some really good translations of Chinese martial arts books, and I hoped that what I wanted to do was close to that Bagua Zhang journal approach of, let's look at the authentic text. Let's look at the actual books, not somebody's sort of idea of what they learned and them speaking. I want to see what the masters of the past spoke. And so let's use these authentic source documents. And people were able to translate better. And now we had the way to print Chinese in books better. So that all happened. And along the way, my boss said, hey, if you want to ever do a book, go ahead. So I was like, really? Oh, wow. Okay. So that was how the origin of my book was like. Just, we needed books to publish, so he said, go make one. So I went and made it, and just stumbled my way into a lot of the people in there, and just it happened to just lucky chances where I happened to find people at the right time and right place. And I had a great experience. It really allowed me to wrap my mind around Chinese martial arts much more, and made connections. I could go visit and train what a bunch, with a whole bunch of very cool people inspired me. And so that's the story of my book. It was just my boss said do it, so I did it, and I'm glad, because now that I'm older, I couldn't do that anymore. I wasn't married. I had no kids. It was I was going to visit a different martial arts school every night after work, because when I first got to the Bay Area, I lived in a very rural place before that and had very little exposure. So when I got to the Bay Area, there was a lot of Chinese martial arts available, and a lot of martial arts of all different kinds. That was the beginning of the MMA golden age that we have now. So there were gyms everywhere, and Chinese martial arts schools descended from the 70s and 80s that still existed, and new, more exciting groups now that we had more contact with the mainland. So there were people coming to visit. And during that time, I was able to make contact with Luo Dexiu of Taiwan, who was teaching the Gao style Bagua. So every summer he was coming to the Bay Area, to East Bay and Berkeley there, and putting on, about 2 weeks of seminars. And I had read about him in Bagua Zhang Journal. So, I saw the sign-up sheet. It said Luo Dexiu on the top, and there was a list of classes. And I just picked up the pen and put my name under every single one of those.
Oh, wow.
I said, I'm signing up for all these, even if I don't do the whatever martial art, their style, I just knew from seeing the magazines that this was one of the guys that I just knew I had to get with, because his articles were great. I'm sure you remember, they had, it was just smart stuff. It was like, you put your foot here and your hand there. It's nothing mystical needed. It was just very clear about angles and about directions. And his techniques looked a lot like the Aikido I had been learning, where you take you sort of deflect the person, and then you come back with a big chop across the neck, or, or an armbar from below. And he just seemed to have the momentum sort of techniques that I had been used to, that I knew could work, but I couldn't make work. Right. I knew there was something missing. In Aikido, I just couldn't seem to make someone fall down. They had to do it on their own.
Right.
And then when I got to Chinese martial arts, then I was able to learn how to knock people down as well.
Yeah, I've never had a direct experience with Aikido myself, but I do like I'm a book nerd, so I do buy books, because I find even reading, philosophies and perspectives from other martial arts can help you better understand things that you from your own. I actually, my Andrea Falk gave me a book. It's an Aikido book that she said was quite interesting. Had some, I forgot what it's called. I've got it here. It's in my bookshelf somewhere. I think it's called The Dynamic Sphere.
That's the best one.
Right.
That's the best one. That's the one from the 70s with the little illustrations in it.
Right. And I really enjoyed reading that book, even though I've never practiced it, So,
I mean, look at those throws. Don't they have, so many of them have that Kobu Baibu type of turning with them, and the big arm movements that they use are so similar to Bagua throwing and chopping techniques, and I don't know, they're really
exactly so
together.
So that's what that was the first thing that struck out at me. It was like, oh, those techniques are very familiar, some of the concepts and even the methods are identical, and then the philosophy and the way they explain certain aspects, I'm like, oh, there's some overlap there too. So it was really interesting. It's a very interesting
of the Japanese martial arts. It's got some similarities in footwork that as a kid they have, just for instance, one of them is Tai no Henko, they call it, where you take what we would call a Kobu step, and then you turn the other direction and do a Baibu. Then you do that front foot does a Kobu, then you turn around and do a Baibu. So it's a straight line, but it's the exact same footwork. And then when I saw, in the park, I saw a guy doing these circles, and I looked at that and I thought, man, there's something about that looks, that's kind of looks like what we kind of do, and I like this better. So, and that led me to pursuing Chinese martial arts, and then finally realizing I needed to go where more teachers are available. So that's what drew me to the Bay Area and doing my book. And then ever since, I've just been lucky enough to have friends to train with, and like I said, Luo Dexiu, a magnificent guy, a wonderful, kind teacher, and also very. His physical skills were just everything that I had been reading about, and just when I got my skeleton just rattled, I realized, wow, this is the type of stuff that Chinese martial arts is about, using very efficient movements where your whole body power hits them at a, you use your whole body against a small point on their body.
Exactly.
In a very natural, intuitive way. So it wasn't like 1, 2, 3 type of techniques. He just had the way of just when you touched him and you shove in one direction, he would just instantly be sweeping the other way. And that's a hallmark of Bagua people who are good, where every direction you launch into them, ends up coming back around at you in just a very intuitive, quick, non-thinking type of way that's built in that I became very enamored of and wanted to try to achieve for myself.
So when you signed up for his classes, with you were just speaking about that one particular instance, had you done Bagua before?
Yeah, my first teacher had taught me up here in the Redwood region of Northern California, sort of a university town that I'm from, Arcata, and there, the university towns, there's always some martial arts people here and there, but he was sort of a martial arts hippie, you might say, who had learned back east. And his teacher's in my book, Gabriel Chen, that I was able to go talk to. But he had, he had learned the forms of Tai Chi, and so he had taught me and my friend the Tai Chi two-person form because we were teenagers who couldn't learn the solo form, but the two-person form we were able to concentrate on. And then I learned the Bagua from him as well, because that's what I was really interested in after seeing him do it. But since it was just forms, we learned some push hands, and I was able to start to really get a sense of Tai Chi's body mechanics. Because doing Japanese martial arts, I had grown up screwing up my knees, twisting things too fast, jumping, getting off the ground in a not a very effective way. And once I did Tai Chi, I learned how to move my knees in the right direction.
Right.
And learned how to keep my spine straight and learn how to keep my weight centered. Things that no one had ever explained to me before. And so I doing that inside Bagua at a high, you're moving much more quickly and you're still using those same alignments. From then on, I was able to do a lot of type of martial arts and sports without hurting myself. Even if I never practiced before, I was able to hold my own because those core mechanics of Tai Chi and Bagua and all Chinese martial arts in general, for the most part, those served me well as I got to visit and train other styles. But he didn't teach me anything about really fighting. And coming from an Aikido cooperative background, you always wonder, like, what if I really chop somebody, would it work? Because you never get a chance to.
Right. So, do you recall what style of Bagua you were learning then?
That was interesting because his teacher had given him a lot of notes, and he had, his teacher Gabriel would write down these notes in Chinese, and then my teacher Chris would write down, he would talk to him, and so they would do these sessions where he'd write down English beneath it, and we'd go through it. And he wrote down all the palm changes. Even though Bagua wasn't his specialty, he did write on the palm changes at least, but mostly Tai Chi and Qigong was his thing.
Okay.
But his system, well, all that Gabriel said is that he'd learned Tai Chi growing up in mainland China, but in Taiwan after the war, he learned Bagua from some political relationship because he was fairly high ranking in the Kuomintang.
Okay.
He learned it from one of those relationships that you have, maybe an equal type of level guy who he said he gave us this photocopied beaten old book it was like 9th, 10th generation photocopy. So you could barely read it, but it was Sun Ji-kun's book.
Oh, okay.
And he said, This is the style that we do. It comes from the same school, but it's not Sun Ji-kun himself that my teacher learned it from. He said all the palm changes are the same except number 7 of ours is different.
Yeah.
And when I looked through the book, even then, actually these are pretty dang similar. So right. I know it's Chang style Bagua, but other than that, it's one of those broken links from the war that of millions of broken links that were never repaired.
The thing is that, people think, I do Cheng style, so all Cheng style looks the same. That's not even true. I mean, I've interacted with Beijing Cheng people from 2 different lineages, and their palm changes are not the same. So if you go to Sun Zhijun or if you go to Liu Jingru, there's differences, but they're both directly connected to the Cheng family. I mean, and at a very close level.
Right, they're the highest level you can be, and yet theirs are slightly different.
And they're different.
What are you gonna do?
Yeah, exactly.
And the Cheng style spread all over the place, so everybody's sets are different. And I've never met anyone who had the exact same set as this.
Right.
But it starts with Dan Huanzhang, Shuang Huanzhang, Sun Shizhang, the same names they always begin with.
Yeah. Even in Liang style, we have that, like the same names, like our Dan Huanzhang, our first palm change of the mother palms. It's a turn back to Chuanzhang. That's our Dan Huanzhang. Whereas other styles have Dan Huanzhang and it's something else. It's that wrapping in and then overturning and turning back, right? So
and so that makes you think that Dong Hai Chuan must have called it that, but the words came down, but everyone's use of the words may have changed over time in different groups.
Oh, completely. So, here's an example. When I was asking about my teacher about why is it called shuang and dan. Okay, I get the dan, single palm change, right?
Yeah.
You turn around, we change palms from one side to the other with a chuanzhang. Okay, I get it. Then why Shuang Huanzhan? Like double palm change. And if you look at the Liang style, like our Shuang is quite complicated compared to the first. There's quite a few techniques in there. And he's like, in our understanding, Shuang combines upper body and lower body actions. So Dan is the upper body action on its own. When we get to Shuang, we start combining up and down. So the double there is that you're doing a palm change, but the upper body and the lower body are both doing actions, and you can see that in our second palm change. So that's an interesting perspective, and it doesn't mean that it's the only perspective.
Right.
So, but
because other people will say it means now you're using both of your hands simultaneously.
Exactly.
Instead, that's the more common way. But that's interesting to think of dividing the top and bottom as the two of Shuang. Yeah.
Right. So there's value to it, even though it might be different from a different perspective. So
yeah, and I love that history. I love Bagua Journal really helped all of us get a sense of the different main groups. Obviously it didn't come close to being comprehensive, but just knowing, they have list of words that's similar to our list of words, but some of their words are different, and why, and how each person translates the different ways of expressing the power, the different techniques. Over time, it's just so fun to encounter them at different levels and increase your own understanding by seeing how each group interprets the meanings.
Yeah, I mean that's another book that was like a treasure trove, or the journal. And I remember getting the CD. So you with all
finally,
and then all
the missing ones. There were always 2 or 3 that you couldn't find.
Exactly. So for me, it was I don't like to read digital books, so I literally printed them out and had them bound. So I've got all of them printed out.
There you go.
In my bookshelf. They're bound. I had it done here, in fact, because it's a lot easier to get that kind of thing done here. So it was bound and printed, and I don't even know where the CD is. I don't even have a CD drive, so that's the other issue.
There they go. Yeah.
So yeah.
No, I'm a book person myself. It's just so much easier to flip through and find what you want and stumble across things that you wouldn't have seen otherwise. But this new generation will have to figure it out on their own. I just fear that if things are a little too easy to find and the secrets aren't as interesting as they used to be, that might reduce their enthusiasm. They may not dream of traveling to Beijing the way you did and make their dreams come true. They may think, I learned it on Skype already. Why should I go? But that's their challenge. They'll have to find a way to keep it alive, because
well, I'll say this, even though talking about the newer generation and the changes in mentality and the kind of, we can say that the less interest in Chinese martial arts in general, I kind of have had experiences with people that left Chinese martial arts to go pursue other, more directly applicable combat arts. And, they never practiced their Chinese martial arts while they were doing that. They kind of gave up on it for about 2, 3, 4 years, And then suddenly they'll contact me after 4 years or 5 years, like, I want to get back into it. Yeah. I'm like, but aren't you doing Thai boxing? He's like, yeah, I'm kind of over it. And I kind of realized all the other value that I had in the Chinese martial arts, and then they come back to it. So there is that too. And I think that's natural. So that will happen one way or the other.
Yeah. And everyone who's taught for a while knows that people disappear for long stretches and pop back up out of nowhere. You'd least expect it. And their love for it continues. And I think one of the things that Tim Cartmel said in my book that rang true to me was like, your first Tai Chi lesson should make you a better fighter. I mean, I was like, whoa, really? Because don't you have to do it for 10 years? Like, no, why are you paying the guy? The first lesson, the
should
sense
have something.
Of relaxation, the sense of awareness, that's going to help you. So even if someone only comes to one lesson, that could give them something to think about and learn and work on for the rest of their life if they never return. So I think these seeds get dropped of, like I was saying about the Tai Chi alignments that I found so amazing and invaluable. If someone told me them, and if no one had ever told me that, I don't know if I ever would have noticed that my knee was cocked the wrong way and screwing up every time I was taking these type of steps and so on. And so you never know. Like someone, maybe training for 20 years isn't for everybody. Maybe it is just a few of us who really do take it to that sort of extreme, but everyone gets something out of it.
Dragon Body, Tiger Spirit, a translation and explanation of the classic text of Xingyi Quan, is available now This critically acclaimed work presents, translates, and explains the core classical texts of the art of Xingyi Quan, many of which have been utilized by other arts, including Taiji Quan, Bagua Zhang, and others. Available in hardcover, softcover, and ebook versions. Get your copy today from mushinmartialculture.com or from Amazon. Take your practice to the next level with Dragon Body Tiger Spirit.
Well, it's also interesting is that even people that only did a cursory stint in learning Chinese martial arts, it kind of changes them permanently in one form or the other. I was just mentioning before we started that my neighbor across the way, it's a new neighbor. They moved in this year. End of last year. So, and on previous episodes of the podcast, some people may have heard some drilling and some noise because they were doing renovations. They were moving in and they were redoing the apartment next door. But when I first met the guy, I was like, there's an air of this guy. I kind of get the feeling of a martial artist, right? So, but I never really broached the subject or whatever. And then last night they were like, okay, come over we've got family over, where they called me and my wife to go over for Chinese New Year's Eve, and we ate, and of course we started drinking, and then we started to get to know each other. And he asked me about what I do, and I just, I'm involved in Chinese martial arts. And he said, oh, really? What do you practice? I'm like, Xingyi and Bagua. I was like, oh, Xingyi, Piz Wan Bong Pao Hung. I'm like, what? Yeah. He's like, yeah, I learned a little bit of that, and I did some Shuai Jiao in my youth. He's retired now, and he said, not too seriously, but I learned. And I was like, I know when somebody says not too seriously. I know what that means. Because then he's like, then he says to me, even up until now, when he is at work even, because he works for a big state company, he's worked for them his whole life. And he said, at times when I have a break period at work, I would go out to the area and do some Santi Shi, and then he started doing Pi and Chuan, and I was like, okay, you see, even if you don't go too deeply into it, there's something there that changes you forever. And he says when he'd feel physically exhausted and mentally exhausted, that's what he'd go and do. And he's not claiming to be a master high level whatever, but it gave him that value. But like I said, I kind of picked that up just by meeting him, And previously, I was just like, oh, there's something, I get the air of somebody who's done some martial arts.
Sometimes you get that vibe, yeah, for sure.
And I've had that even with myself. I'd be in a store somewhere, and then somebody would look at me and say, you do Kung Fu, don't you? I'm like, what? I was buying milk. Where did that come from, So
it is a fraternity of sorts where,
Yeah.
sometimes you can sort of feel it coming. Yeah, it's funny.
So we spoke about your initial teacher, which was up in Northern California, you mentioned? Yeah. And then where did you go when you moved on to Berkeley? Who did you end up going to, and what did you end up doing?
In Berkeley, I was able to train a couple different schools. I had a great experience training with Vince Black's Tang Shu Dao group for a little while.
Right.
Got to meet some of those guys and got a good knocking around from them. And then, I was doing, like I said, I was 25 at the time. And so after work, I would go get a cup of coffee, lay in my car for a while, and then around 6 or 7, go visit whatever school I had targeted. Yeah. And so most nights of the week when I didn't have some other class, I would go to an Aikido school or a Kung Fu, usually the, Asian martial arts that I like the best.
Right.
So I was able to, especially in the East Bay, visit a lot of different groups and, make contact with some really cool people, but, mostly for just short periods. But again, I was able to get into Luo Dexiu's training. So during the year, we would train as a group of friends. And then every summer he would come and the seminars would go on and everybody would gather from all around and put on some really great long classes that were just long training days where his style of teaching involves, just repeating basics, Jiben Gong over and over, then repeating forms over and over, then repeating applications over and over. And he will just pile it on in the traditional Chinese way of just overloading you. And once you start getting good at something, jump to the next thing. So you never get a chance to completely memorize or get it perfect yet. On to the next thing. And especially that Gao style is quite large. It's got the 64 straight line forms and just a mass of Jiben Gong exercises that go with it, and sets of entries and sets of throwing ideas and just, so there's groupings of different types of training within it that are just extensive. Like a lot of Bagua schools, there's just plenty to do. So all year long, we would be, and I had a great group of friends where we train a couple nights a week and just follow his approach of like, do 10 sets of this set and then do 20 applications of all the ones he taught us on each side. And then between us, we were able to remember a lot of it. So we had 4 or 5 of us who could all...
good. Rely on each other's memory.
And at the end of class, we'd always film ourselves doing it afterwards out in the parking lot to try and make sure we remember everything. And so I think a little bit, the unhealthy side of it is we tried to remember every single thing he taught us without asking too much. Maybe it's better to just stick with the ones that stick in your mind. But I always felt like, again, I don't know if I'm ever going to get a chance to train with this guy again. He lives across the world. So I had to squeeze every drop out of that training. So in that process, we were able to train up until 2019 was his last visit. So basically 20 years. Every summer he'd come and we would train. And then, I was lucky enough to go to Taiwan and train there. And he also trained at other places in the States I was able to visit. So I was able to get a good sense, even as a seminar student, which is not the ideal way to learn by any means. Like,
well, it's still better than nothing.
Right. So, and I had enough friends around that we could say, hey, did he do it like this or like that? Or did he grab it right here or grab it like that? No, his hand was over here. Like, so between us, we'd settle on the way we'd agree on and then do the application. So I think, having a group of friends to train with is one of the best things you can get in Chinese martial arts because a lot of the training is done on your own, but having friends who are into it too makes it so much more fun because then you've got inspiration and you can bounce the ideas off each other. And it can be lonely in Chinese martial arts, especially if you're pursuing an esoteric, weird style like Bagua that's not everywhere. So you kind of, and then, it doesn't attract, it's sometimes those of us who do Chinese martial arts are more of the bookish type at times who are naturally more reserved or whatever. But if you can find friends to train with, it's going to make everything you do a lot better and a lot funner and you improve a lot more.
Totally. And also you can rely on each other's memories. Mm-hmm. So that's one of the things I remember once again when I was interacting with my various Bagua uncles. The differences between them in terms of like memorization, even from their learning with Li Ziming. So my teacher was the one who they'd rely on because he's the one who would always be record keeping. So he had this habit, which I inherited, of he takes notes.
Yeah.
To this day, I mean, he's old, and to this day, he has a daily journal. There's a daily diary. He's had that since he was a kid. He's got piles of them. So he'll remember, like, oh, when did I first teach this student? And you'll think, oh, I was this year, and he'll go back and find it in his diary entries. Oh, on this day, this guy came from this country, and his initial thoughts of the person, right? So. And the difference between him and the other martial uncles, in that regard, he would be the one that'd be like, oh, what was the next technique? We've kind of forgotten. He'd be like, hold on, it's this. It's not that, it's this,
I'm a notebook person too, man. I got into that when I was in college, and for some reason I always felt like in Bagua Journal, it would say traditionally the teacher would let you copy one page at a time out of his book. And so to me, that inspired me to think, well, I'll just keep writing down things. And I ended up, again, maybe it's a little obsessive. Maybe it's not 100% healthy to write everything down, but I always felt drawn to doing it that way. And so in my book, I would record the teacher saying things about his life or about his friendships or his schoolmates. I'd also write down the techniques and the forms, but I also wanted to write down their personality and little tidbits and funny stories they told or fight stories and stuff.
Yeah.
So in my notes and books and my journals have some pretty funny stuff that I can go back and, oh, you remember that time and some of the great conversations you have in Chinese martial arts when you're sitting around after class that you forget. But if I can write a few stories down, I always try to do that.
Yeah. I mean, I remember my teacher even telling me he had been doing his primary teacher was Zhao Zhong, who taught him when he was a kid, and then when he became a teenager, started teaching him Xingyi. When he was young, obviously he didn't teach him Xingyi, but then he started teaching him Xingyi when he was a bit older. And then my teacher told me that, as he got older, then he'd go around to the various parks and public places where people were training and have little, tests with random people every now and then.
Yeah.
So, and this is when I asked him, why did you start doing 戳脚翻子拳? And he told me, well, I went and I had this exchange with this guy, and he kicked me a few times, and I was like, geez, that footwork is really good. And he asked him, what is he doing? He's like, 戳脚翻子. So he went back to his teacher. He's like, I think I want to learn some 戳脚翻子. And he's like, okay, well, my good friend Wu Binlo, so he's like, I'll take you to him. And he took him to meet Wu Binlo. Now, Wu Binlo is a legend in 戳脚翻子. He's like the primary guy who was disseminating the art in Beijing, and he even went to Japan in the early, years of the 1900s to do a performance for the emperor's birthday and beat up a few of the Japanese martial artists there. He didn't know because, again, if you know Wu Binlo's personality, he didn't know that it was impolite and it was just a friendly kind of exchange, but he beat the guys up in front of the Japanese emperor, and he was and they wanted him to stay, and he was like, no, I'm getting back on the boat and going home. They wanted him to stay to teach. But, my teacher recounted the story of his teacher taking him to meet Wu Binlo.
Yeah.
And, back in those days, I don't know if you know, during the bad days of the communist economy,
of course, yeah.
they had coupons. So you didn't like, oh, I want to buy this, and therefore if you've got the money, if you didn't have coupons for a particular thing, a ticket, you don't get to buy it. You see, that's the thing. And my teacher was poor. He told me he has it written down. Exactly how much money he spent.
Oh my goodness.
To pay for the meal. He remembers what was bought. This piece of cake was like 12 cents or something, and this and that. It was a lot of money he paid for the meal. And his teacher said to Wu Binlo, my student wants to learn 戳脚翻子 from you. And Wu Binlo said, okay, well, I accept. And then my teacher's Zhao Zhong, his teacher, told him, all right, so this is now your second shifu. Get on your knees and ketou,
Wow.
And he did it right there, and then from then he started learning. He didn't go too deep. I mean, 戳脚翻子 is a massive system.
Is it? Okay.
Yeah, it's massive.
I've never experienced it firsthand, but that's a famous Chinese martial arts style.
Well, it's a combination of two. They've got 戳脚 sets and fanzi sets. It's massive. I have no idea how people like Wu Binlo memorized and remembered all of that, but they were professional martial artists, so that's basically all they had to do. But it was massive, and my teacher recounts when he started learning from him, he'd cycle out to they train in the front part of the Forbidden City. Back then you could, and in the mornings, and he'd go there before work. So early hours of the morning, he'd ride his bicycle out there, and every time he got there, because Wu Binlo's wife had passed away, he was a widower rather, and he'd find his teacher there no matter what time he arrived. Even if he's like, I'm going to be the first student there, he gets there. And like, nope, his teacher's there kicking away. And he's like, all right, you know what? Tomorrow I'm going to get up before the sun even gets up and arrive. And he gets to the Forbidden City, and the sun, it's not even, it's still dark. And he's like, oh, I'm first. And then he hears pa-pow, pa-pow. And there's Wu Binlo. He's already there training, So, and these little anecdotes and these little stories are great because they just give you a perspective and an inspiration, So, yeah.
And how hard people work to work on these skills and preserve these skills. I mean, I'm mostly, especially in my advanced age, I can get an hour of training in per day if I make sure I get it in my, at all the right times. But these guys were on a whole nother level at the early part of the 20th century when they were really cultivating this stuff. And you realize that, man, the guys who were good at this were training at a level that aren't the same as what the average me type person is training now.
Right. And also the sacrifices they had to make. Like I said, my teacher was working in a factory, as many people did. But you'd think, oh, okay, well, I've got a hard day's work and I'm working. I'm not going to... No, they'd get up in the morning.
Right.
And go train for 2 hours before work. And then after work, they'd train again. So, this was their life, and they made sacrifices. They weren't making money out of this. They were getting small salaries. China was poor, so it's an interesting
So, I
insight.
mean, we got to respect that. I mean, it leaves us in a weird position of, some of the teachers I've had a very high bar. They believed that you should be striving to perfect this. And I'm an average guy with an average job and a family and stuff. And I know I could never give my whole life to it. So I never, I feel like I don't want to let down previous generations who worked extra hard, because I make sure I practice every day, but some of those days are shorter than others because of my responsibilities. And yet Chinese martial arts is known for having this high level of fulfilling your potential in Chinese martial arts requires an absolutely massive foundation of hard work to put into that. And the guys who did it, they have a very, I don't want to say there's an arrogance, but it's more like a high standard of, this is something that isn't to be taken lightly. And that may, so I'm not training at that level. So I feel like, am I letting them down? But in the long run, I think it takes everybody to be part of it. There's the people who only come once in a while. There's the people who do train, but not a ton. And then there's the people who sacrifice everything to make it their whole life, which is pretty much the position you're in. And it takes all of us, because like all those other people like it too. And so you can all go to dinner together with all those people, right?
Yeah.
And we're all part of the same community.
It's just you gotta fit, make martial arts part of your life. Like, even if you can't make it your total 100% focus of your life, if you're doing it, daily as best as you can, whether that's an hour, even if today you don't have an hour, you've got 35 minutes and that's all you can put in. Hey, that's still good. That's still
right.
The consistency over a long period is more important than the intensity over a short period. So that's the value of these practice. Like I said, it's got to be a lifestyle practice. It's got to be, many times people would ask at training, my teacher, they'd ask him, how often and how much should I train? And he'd say, it's like eating. And they'd be like, what? In Chinese, literally, 跟吃饭一样. That's literally his words. Like, what do you mean it's like eating? He's like, well, you eat every day, right? Yeah. And you don't need to eat too much or too little. You need to just eat enough. And some days enough is more than other days, and then that's it.
Yeah,
so
that's
just
a good way to put it.
Like eating. That's it, So yeah, that's how. And sometimes I find myself, sometimes I'm a little bit busy in the one day and I didn't put in the time of training that I wanted to, but I'll find a slot and I'm like, all right, cool, I'll go do some Neigong for about 45 minutes, right? And maybe that's all I got away with that day because something popped up and interfered with my plans for the next training session in the day. But that's just how it goes. You can't wait for perfect weather before you leave the house, right?
Go.
So you got to just deal with it as it comes. If you need an umbrella today, take an umbrella. If you don't need an umbrella but you need sunblock, well then put on some sunblock. That's just how your training should be. It should adapt to whatever happens in your life as best as you can. So,
pretty much. And I guess my takeaway is that there is room for everybody. And even though Chinese martial arts do have sky-high expectations and a standard that's untouchable of the generations previously, still all we can do is toil away one day at a time and do our part as best we can and enjoy our training and our friendships. So as long as that goes on, I think Chinese martial arts can continue to contribute.
No, I agree completely. Well, I'd like to get back to a couple of questions with regards to your experiences after you wrote the book. I'm sure going through the process of interviewing these teachers, as you mentioned, there were perspectives, insights, and ideas that were new. Did you find from the time you published the book and did those interviews, and then going forward through your training life, did you find that it affected your perspective and certain aha moments after the publication of the book?
Yeah, for sure. I think, I was lucky enough, my boss sort of allowed me it gave me the space to do this project. Obviously didn't give me any money to do it, but I went out and found the people.
Yeah.
And by having that exposure all sort of over a couple-year period, I think it really was valuable to my training going forward. I mean, A, I made a lot of friends, but B, having that perspective of all the different ways you can approach Chinese martial arts. It was kind of like a crash course. I just got overloaded with all the different ideas that people were throwing around, and that allowed me to feel like I could pick and choose the ones that made sense to me and pursue the directions that made sense to me. So,
Right.
in my training with Luo Dexiu, I identified that this type of fluidity in motion, the intuitive way of responding, the way every time his body made contact, it didn't matter what part he was using, it would thump with the full force and then swiftly circle around to hit from the other direction with, and conserving the force between every strike. The way he used his legs to sweep while he's controlling your hands, the way he would change from one direction to another in a way that just would absolutely create whiplash. And my Aikido training pretty much allowed me to survive because taking these Bagua throws are just absolutely lightning speed, feet in the air, slamming on the a lot of times hardwood floor, but hopefully on mats. That, again, that cross training allowed me to survive that. So I was able to be the person to step up and take some of those throws and learn from that. If I hadn't had previous experience, I wouldn't have been able to take those throws and learn those. And so anyways, all that is just to say, in your martial arts journey, don't be afraid to reach out and find other schools and other classmates and other people either in your style or outside styles. It's intimidating at first, and it can be scary to walk in that door and introduce yourself and say, hey, I do stuff. I want to see what you guys do. Yeah. And I think that experience served me well in learning as I went. And people don't, I agree. There is the side of I don't want to pollute what I know with someone else's thing. I want to get good at it first. And there's something to be said for that. But at the same time, don't worry about that. If what you're doing is good, you're not going to pollute it and damage it. All it's going to do is open your horizons and give you some new people to try your skills out. And you know what? You might get beaten in their school a few times, but after you learn their rule set and how they do it, you might just find yourself doing okay with what you already know. And that was my experience. I hadn't done any sparring, but, I tried karate speed sparring where you just touch. And then I did some full contact with kickboxing rules with gloves and shin pads. And I was able to hold pads in Muay Thai and feel the power there and exchange some sparring blows there. And when I went to visit Tim Carpel in Southern California, I got grappled and choked and twisted up into pretzel. And
exactly,
I mean, and all those were great experiences. It can be intimidating, but it's always worth it to go outside your comfort zone, check out what other people are doing, and sooner or later you'll realize what you've got is better than you thought, maybe.
Yeah, well, exactly. I mean, that's an anecdote from my own experience. I started doing jiu-jitsu here, in some senses because of, some of the ideas I gleaned from Tim Cartmell's experience. Yeah. So I sought out a teacher here. He was an American. He was actually the first black belt to start teaching in Beijing. He had been here for a very long time. And I sought him out. His name is Chet Quint. He was an old school. He actually studied with Pedro Sauer. Pedro Sauer was one of the first. If you've ever seen that YouTube video of the old Gracie fights, there was a bodybuilder fighting one of the old Gracie guys. His name was, I think it was Mr. Utah. Anyway, he was a bodybuilder, and this little guy, triangled him, I think. Right. That was Pedro Sauer. But, that was like no holds barred. They were punching whatever. And he was go. So that's who this guy that I studied from got his training through. So he's an older generation. So when I went to meet him, I that was just me firstly, I wanted to have fresh bodies to try throw and do stuff on outside of my direct group of training brothers. And I thought, let's see what this jiu-jitsu stuff is all about. And my first day there, I didn't know, much of the floor stuff. That's completely new. But I had body mechanics, movement, and the basic, from the Chinese martial arts. And I remember there was we started doing the sparring session of the class, and this guy who had been there for a while, I think it was a blue belt. And I started sparring with him, and it was my first day. I've never done this, and he starts trying to do his thing, and I just reacted intuitively, and the next thing I'm on his back, and I'm basically choking, and I just remember him turning his head back and looking at me with this complete shock on his face, like what the hell just happened? And I was like, yeah, you see you'll find that there's aspects, even if it's a completely different practice, that carry over. Sure. And then you realize, okay, so that's what this is really about, some of these aspects that are universal. So, and oddly enough, when I got to talking to the teacher there, he said, oh, you do Chinese martial arts? He said he does too. I said, oh, really? What do you do? He said, well, mostly Shuai Jiao, but he's done some other stuff too. He was very interested in Shuai Jiao. And I said, he asked me what I did when I said Bagua. I said, oh, okay. do you know Zhao Dayuan? I'm like, oh, he's my uncle. What a small world, you know. He's like, oh, really? He's your uncle. I said, how do you know him? He said, well, he learned from Li Baoru, which is the legend of Shuai Zhao, then basically 90-year-old, the guy who you probably seen Beijing's ageless wrestler. He was one of the pioneers. Anyway, he started doing Shuai Zhao with Li Baoru, and Li Baoru used to teach and train outside of Tiantan. He always has, the Temple of Heaven. And that's where Zhao Dayuan was also teaching, which is actually where Zhao Dayuan teaches was classically very close to where Cheng Tinghua used to teach.
Wow.
So, anyway, small
world in Beijing, apparently. It's a huge city, but Chinese martial arts is a small world.
Exactly. And he said when he was when he went to meet Li Baoru talked to him and said, oh, now I'm going to take you to meet somebody else in this park. And he's one of two people in the park who actually know how to fight. And he's like, who are you going to take me to see? Zhao Dayuan. So then Chet, my teacher, says to Li Baoru, so if he's the one of two people who knows how to fight, who's the other one? And Li Baoru just looks at him with this like ridiculous look on his face, like, me, of course. Who the hell do you think I'm talking about?
If you enjoy the Drunken Boxing podcast, as well as all the other Mushin martial culture endeavors, please do support us if you can at patreon.com. We have 2 support tiers there that you can pledge to help us continue to do the work that we do and continue to bring you the podcast as well as all our other works. If you would like to make a once-off tip or donation to our endeavors, please visit the link listed in the show notes or scan the QR code here. Thank you to everyone who supports us.
So this great little.
There's that high standard of Chinese martial arts. Where,
yeah, exactly.
Praise is hard to find and compliments are few.
Yeah. So I found that for me the experience of even going down the grappling route has really helped, because we do a lot of China, we do a lot of throws, but we don't do stuff that's floor dedicated. So it's a very interesting addition,
Absolutely. No, a critical component, right? I mean, I think it's a whole art of its own that Chinese martial arts doesn't usually focus on, but I think it's well worth studying and something anybody who wants to do martial arts should have some at least passing knowledge of what to do on the ground, because it's a real thing, and if you're not trained in it, you're helpless. So you got to do something with it for sure.
Yeah,
at least.
For sure. So and
I know you got your black belt, right? So congratulations.
No, I'm a brown. I'm still brown.
Cut that part out. You got your brown belt. Congratulations. That's a massive achievement. And I don't think maybe not everyone realized, but a brown belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is a very meaningful rank that is not given easily. So you must have really put in the time and effort.
Oh yeah, and I'm just that kind of for me, martial arts is basically that's life. So if I don't do anything half. So when I started jiu-jitsu, I was like, all right, I'm gonna see this through. I'm not going to half-ass it or 2 years in, 3 years in, quit. I thought just push through and see how it adds. Yeah, and it's an interesting addition, I must say.
Yeah, it seems like a good thing to match with Chinese martial arts and combine for sure.
Well, a lot of the China that we do in Liang style Bagua, I directly used there too. I mean, there's been times where I on the floor used some of the specific locks.
That's funny, yeah.
And submitted people very, very, and it's stuff they hadn't seen. Some of these.
Oh, interesting.
Some of
so
these
it was
locks,
moves that they didn't even have.
Or approaches. I mean, in general, most of the locks are pretty similar, but how to get there sometimes is different.
Again, like a whole science of its own, right? So
right.
That's a world that you could go as deep as you want, and there is only so much time to train. But a good knowledge of stand up, a good knowledge of clinching, a good knowledge of China, a good knowledge of throwing, a good knowledge of falling, and floor grappling. Each of those things is an important part of martial arts that you got to have at least a little of each, and then find one that you really like the most. But
Yeah, exactly. Well, so after your initial publication of the book, what was the reception like?
I got a lot of very nice emails from people. I think I've found a lot of, and over the years, I'll run into people and say, hey, wait, that was your book. Yeah, dude, I loved it. Like, I think it really accomplished its goal, which was to reach out to the people I call sort of martial arts nerds or martial arts people like us who like the books and inspired by the stories. And, you know, there's always going to be bros who just don't care about that half of it or that part of it, which is cool. That's not part of it just doesn't interest them. And I dig that. But there are those of us who want to contrast and compare and following that Bagua Zhang journal theme of looking at the old documents, looking at how different schools approach the training. What are the commonalities? What are the things that we can learn from each other and so on. And if you had that intellectual curiosity and you wanted to see all these perspectives, this book was for you. And so I think it reached those type of people pretty well. And although it's out of print now, you can still get a used copy on Amazon if you want.
It's out
one.
of print.
So,
okay.
Yeah,
okay.
It had a good run though. I think maybe close to 20 years it was in print. So.
No,
most books
good.
don't last that long, and like you said though, it's a piece of its time and its era, and now we have a world full of online products and online videos and your podcasts like yours where you're going directly to the source, talking to people who are the premier teachers of their school, or talking to someone like Andrea Falk, who's just been in Chinese martial arts in China since 1980 and
has she's just really
incredible
a pioneer.
Perspectives, right? And the books that we were sort of publishing at that time were just a fraction of what the information that's now out there that I enjoy, that I'm glad is out there. And and books continue to. I still collect martial arts books, and every day there's more and more of them, and translations that are cool, and old photos that resurface. And my hope is that people will continue to dig up old materials. From old articles and books that are previously published that haven't been seen in a long time, will continue to surface. Kang Liu in Taiwan was, he's been republishing old books for a long time there, and I just know out there's so much more that still hasn't even been exposed. Maybe not even in Chinese for a long time, but especially not in English.
Yeah,
there's a lot more, and you made a tremendous effort with your book to try and get some of those traditional teachings that have been, oral tradition teachings that have been written down. I'm just looking forward to more old films, old video, old photos that may emerge, old articles and so on.
And they still are. That's the interesting thing. I mean, I had Zhang Yukai on. He's a Gao style practitioner out of Taiwan who started in Taiwan, but then started going directly to Tianjin to study. And I had him on, and it was interesting to see that we were talking about a video that had surfaced just a couple of years prior of Zhang Junfeng doing some practice. I'm sure you've seen it. Yeah. I'm sure you've seen it where he's doing some Tiangan. He's doing the heavenly stems practices.
Yeah, and he does pretty much everything. He covers tons of the Gao style system there.
Yeah, but that's the interesting thing that was. I mean, it's not as if that was filmed now. I mean, the guy's been gone for so long, but that little footage only became public like recently. So and it was interesting because I was looking at that video, and then in the middle there's some staff practice. He's doing some staff stuff. Mm-hmm, it's just a small section, and then it cuts back to some bare hand stuff, back to the Gao style stuff. And I immediately recognized the staff stuff because it's a form that my teacher had taught me, but I hadn't seen anybody else doing it the way we do it. So I immediately recognized it. I was like, hang on, that's Zhou Gun. That's 9 provinces staff from our it's Xingyi, by the way. And I immediately recognized it because there were certain techniques in there done exactly, and they're quite unique, that were done exactly the same way my teacher has taught me. And I asked Zhang Yukai, he's like, oh, you recognize the form? He's like, yeah, and it's just interesting. So there might still be stuff that pops up over time that, who knows?
I'm sure of it. I'm sure. I mean, I know it's out there, but the heartbreaking part is that right now somebody's going through their grandpa's old box of crap and like old notebooks and journals and pictures of people they don't know, and it's going straight in a dumpster in some hutong that's being, torn down to build a new shiny building. And that's just the killer part for people like us who love that history and love that culture and the, just the fashion and the style of the 1920s and 30s, just to think that all that, there's just golden bits just disappearing, every year. But that's the nature of history and archaeology and learning this stuff. Is Chinese martial arts has lost 99% of all the Chinese martial arts that's ever existed.
Yeah,
and
for
yet
sure.
Still, it's an incredible rich heritage.
Yeah.
So
Exactly.
that's, this unfortunate extinction is part of it. But that's always been part of it.
Yeah. So just for the listeners, I don't think we've said the full name of the book. The book that you
right.
published is called Nei Jia Quan, Internal Martial Arts,
Right.
Teachers of Taiji Chuan, Xingyi Chuan, and Bagua Zhang. Now, in the book, you have, I think it's 16 interviews
Something
in
like
total.
that, yeah.
But you obviously did a bunch more. I mean, I don't think you just did those 16 and then you decided that's it.
I did do some more, but not a lot more. The ones that I did, there were some people who wouldn't be interviewed, and I mean, I remember one teacher who since passed away, who was from Shanghai and had been living in the States for a long time, but he had learned Yichuan for many years from one of the direct students of the founder, and so he had and he didn't want to be interviewed. He said, "I don't believe in people writing everything or recording everything." I'm like, "Okay, fine." Then we had a 2-hour conversation where he told me all these amazing fight stories and back history and naming names and dates and who was great and who wasn't, and all his training all through the 1960s and 70s. And by the time we were done, I'm just like, if only he had let me record that and I could write. And at the end, he was like, "Hey, maybe I will do an interview with you sometime. You're pretty cool." And I was just, if only, I should have secretly recorded it, for posterity's sake, right? But
even for yourself.
There was just some heart, and I was able to interview one great teacher, Li Tai Liang, who's the Xingyi teacher. And you'll notice that art isn't represented in the book because my tape recorder died in the middle of the interview and I didn't realize it. The batteries in my old, it wasn't digital at the time, so those things would run out on you. And he took a whole lunch period for an hour and a half and told me all the stories of his style and all the best masters and why they did the squatting monkey the way they do and all these things. And, I was able to remember a few things from my notebook, but I was on the way home just kicking myself going, man, I just had this great opportunity and blew it. But, those are the things that happen along the way. But so there were some that missed out, and one that unfortunately I was able to go to a class being held by Master Sudong Chen from Taiwan, who was here in Los Angeles. And so I drove all the way down there and fought my way through traffic and got there. But I surprised him with the request, and he agreed to go be interviewed right there. And we went to the restaurant, and his translator was telling me everything, and he was giving me all the stories from Taiwan that I was loving. But the dishwashers the whole time had just been furiously stacking dishes and washing. And when I listened to the tape, it was absolutely just annihilated with just clashing and clanging and breaking dishes sounds. And the whole interview was just...
I've had that a couple of times with podcast recordings. And like I said, they just started drilling upstairs. And you think it's okay. And then I listen back. This is unusable. It's unusable. They've destroyed it. But the reason why I mentioned that you probably have some more, and had you ever thought about doing a follow-up like Nei Jia Quan 2 or?
Yeah, I mean, I felt like that was my piece of the puzzle, and what we have now is anybody can interview their teacher and put them on YouTube, and that we can all benefit from that. So I think it would be fun for me to do, but I'm not sure that it would be serving the public. And since I have a family now and a lot more responsibilities than I did then, it would be a lot more difficult. So I'm unfortunately not able to continue it. Like, it would be great if it could be a magazine I could just keep doing. But, I will hopefully, now that my kids are almost grown up, maybe I'll have a chance to do some more interviews and maybe do those in podcast form or whatever.
Okay.
And I've turned my attention to a friend of mine, Isaac Kamens and I, who both trained under his teacher, B.K. Franzis, for quite a long time. We've been having a podcast together, and we've interviewed a number of people we know through that school, talking about Chinese martial arts in the USA and how it developed in that school. So we've been having fun looking at some history, looking at some classics as best as we can understand them, and just talking about our experiences there. So I've been that's kind of been my creative outlet in terms of my writing, and in terms of publishing anything, has been to what we call Nei Jia Quan podcast, just based on the book. And it's been fun. We just create interviews, sort of giving our opinions on, some of the great fight stories of Chinese martial arts and looking at the history of that school and the different lineage masters over the years. And so that's been fun to, the sources in English are limited, so there's only so much we can really cover. And I feel like there's a lot more out there, since I can't read Chinese, that's waiting to eventually be discovered. But it's just fun. Like we love to talk about it, and so we figured, hey, we'll just record it and throw it out there. Kind of like what you're doing with yours, and we're gonna talk anyways, so we might as well put it out there if people find it entertaining. And some people write and tell us stuff that we didn't know. So
yeah, for sure. Well, I'll put some links to that. And then people can check it out as well. So
yeah, appreciate that. Yeah.
I kind of feel sad to hear that Nei Jia Quan, the book, is not in print anymore.
Yeah.
But and I was wondering, in today's age where print on demand is a feasible option. There's maybe you should consider, I don't know, speaking to the former publisher about maybe putting it up, because I'm not so sure it's gonna be like, it's not a political book that's gonna be a bestseller in terms of volume, but there are gonna be enough people interested, and it would be a shame if they can't get their hands on it.
True. So, well, that's a good idea. I've kind of meant to get around to that, and there are some other out of print books that I'd like to see in print. So at some point I'm going to gather up some stuff and make it available, just so people can get copies if they want.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, but that would be fun. That would be good to keep it going. And books have their place, and I think they always will. And the digital world is great too, and it's basically great to have both. It's a golden age on that level. I mean, it may not be the golden age of Chinese martial arts in terms of the masters that could once fly and do death touch and stuff like that, but in terms of compared to the 1980s, when there was, you could barely pronounce any of these words. Like these things didn't exist. We really have a lot of resources and information and materials that inspire us. So
for sure,
my training's as fun as it's ever been, and I'm not planning to stop.
Yeah, that's good to hear. Well, I don't want to take up your entire. What time is it there now?
Oh, it'll be dinner time pretty soon here.
All right. Well, yeah, you. It's been great talking to you, getting these insights. We could carry on for hours.
Yeah, no, we got to talk again sometime. It's great to make touch. It sounds like we have a lot of loves in common in terms of martial arts books. So we should compare some of the collection and see if we can fill up any holes we might have. For
sure. Well, we'll put some contact details, whatever you want to be made public, in the show description here. I'll get that from you, and people want to reach out to you. I highly recommend people try get their hands on your book, Nei Jia Quan, if they can find it. If in some senses, if it's only available through second hand, but at a higher price, it's still worth it. Get your hands on it. It's something you want to keep.
It's still pretty competitively priced. Let's put it that way. You should be able to get one pretty cheap.
All right. Well, anyway, we'll put all that information out there as well. So thanks so much for your time. It's been great chatting.
The honor is all mine. Thank you, Byron. Great talking to you, man.
All right. Have a good evening.
Take care. Bye.